Hello, welcome to today's video. We're going to be talking about another task that Excel users are very familiar with. And since a lot of the business analysts that initially start using Alteryx had come to rely heavily on Excel to do the work for them, whether it be extracting data, manipulating data, or preparing data for reporting, their questions always seem to arise of, well, I can do this in Excel. How can I do that same thing in Alteryx? And so one of the data manipulations that so many business analysts rely upon Excel to do for them is to create the pivot table and then generate a pivot chart. Typically that pivot chart might be interactive. They might also use one of the reporting tools at their disposal, but they're used to taking their raw data and with the flip of a switch kind of deal, get Excel to create that pivot table for them. So we're going to take a look today in this tutorial of walking through the steps that you can take in order to generate that Alteryx version of a pivot table and move that data into an Excel spreadsheet, which people are comfortable with, and then they can report from it and do other manipulations there. However, the recommendation always is just go ahead and put your data that you've generated from a pivot creation process and put it into some other type of highly accessible data store, such as a YXDB file, an Alteryx table. Put it in your local reporting database, or even create a specific file for your downstream reporting tool. It always helps to look at what it is that you want to create. And so I've already created this workflow, made sure it works the way I need it to before I can walk you through the steps that I employed to get it done. But this is what the typical pivot table looks like in Excel. On the left, we have our dimensions. We have breed name, kennel name, and the three events that we'll be working with. We'll be working with the birth, performance, and training events for our puppies. And we want to do this at an aggregate level, not at the individual level, because it's just too much data that you would want to process. And across the top, we have the actual weeks of the year, and then the number of events summarized by our three dimensions. And so this becomes the data that we can explore inside of Excel or use it for reporting purposes. We also wanted to look at generating both the subtotal within this as well. People ask, how can I get a subtotal out of Alteryx? The answer is you can. And at the very bottom of this, we also generate the total for the entire aggregation of the data. As a preview and to look at this, we're going to close this because we'll be writing it out of our workflows. We don't want to get it in our way. It's always nice to remember what our data marts look like. And so here is my model. We'll be dealing with the puppy fact in order to get the breed and kennel names along with the birth date. Now, when I originally built this, I was a bit in a hurry, and I realized much later on that this isn't fitting as standard, and so we'll have to clean up some of this relationship, because realistically, if I was to build this again, which I haven't rebuilt it, the birth date should come from the date dimension and be a dimension in the puppy fact. Not having that is going to get in our way, and so that's a nice way to look at how to clean up some of your data yourself that you have. We also have our performance fact table that we'll be dealing with, and again, this one is a much neater format or much cleaner format. And then finally, way over here, we did our training fact table. So we're going to bring these three fact tables together and go ahead and do our aggregation there. And you'll see how we do this in Alteryx, which is probably a bit different than you would do it in Excel, but it's much more straightforward and to a degree much cleaner. Let's move all this out of our way. Bring up our not completely empty Alteryx workflow. As you can see here, what I've done is I've prepped the beginning of this by bringing in my tables that I need. Here is my puppy dimension, which has the puppy date in it, puppy's birth date in it. We have the puppy fact, which will allow us to get the breed and kennel IDs. Our date dimension is necessary for two reasons. One is to rationalize the birth date to match the dates that are in the training and performance facts, and secondarily to get that year week out of the date much more directly by going into date dimension. That being said, we also have the puppy training fact, which includes the date and the breed and kennel, and the same applies to the puppy performance fact. And obviously, to get the names out of the IDs for the dimensions, we need to take a look at the breed dimension and the kennel dimension. So bringing all this together will allow us to generate that pivot table. So our first task is to get the data out of our puppy dimension puppy fact table and our training and performance fact tables into the same set of fields, so that post-processing it becomes straightforward and easily done in single steps rather than multiple steps. And this is where Alteryx is very helpful, as opposed to a giant SQL query or putting a bunch of tabs together inside of an Excel worksheet. And heading down that path, again, we talked about some of the inconsistencies of what I built and how we need to get over them. The first one has to do right here with getting this much more readily joinable, is going ahead and changing the width from dimension into puppy width and getting that date cleaned up. And we will do that with a series of joins. A lot of what we do in today's exercise is going to be out of your favorites, especially since I added one additional thing to it, which is a tool container, and we'll use that much later. So that being said, what we want to do is join our two tables together. Identify what we want to do is we join puppy width to puppy width. We do not need the right puppy width coming out of this, so we can go ahead and turn that off here. And as I always recommend, it's a good idea to continue to work one step at a time. We want to make sure as we go through this process is that we don't leave any facts behind. So you can see that on the right and on the left there is nothing left, everything's in the join. Our next step is going to be to go ahead and get this calendar date into the dimension width, which we need to match what else is in these other fact tables, as well as so that we can go ahead and get the week of the year out of this. And again, as I build this, you may see a different way of solving it, and that is perfectly fine. This is just simply the way that I saw the most direct way of building it and what I was comfortable with. So we want to go ahead and join our date into our puppy data. And on the left, which is a date dimension, we have the date warehouse ID or date width, the unique ID. And on this one, we have the, we don't want to do that, sorry. We want to use the alternate key. We also have in here is the raw calendar date, which is also unique. Nice to have it there. And then I can go ahead and bring in the birth date that matches that. Taking a quick look down here to see if anything I can throw out at the beginning. The answer is no. I'll just go ahead and keep all of this in here right now. It looks clean enough to me. So we can go ahead and run this. And again, I am worried at making sure that I don't leave anything out of my fact table. And you can see everything is in the join that I need. I do have some things left over in the left because there's a bunch of dates I did not use. So we'll go ahead and drag a select onto here so we can do some data cleanup as we move forward into these guys here. And this is where I'm trying to consolidate the data into being the same type of data. And so basically I need the date width. I no longer need the calendar date. I do not need the week of year number, although I can pick it up here. I will pick this up all in one fell swoop after I join my data. I no longer need to know my puppies. I no longer need my birth date. I simply need my breed and my kennel. So I have my date. And we're going to give this a new name so it can match across the string. I'm going to call this pivot date warehouse ID, because that matches what I've done here, which is I have my pivot date warehouse ID, my breed and my kennel. and the same for my performance. Now what I am missing is that if I join this data together now, I will forget its source because I want to know what these events are. I have 3 different events. I want to identify those 3 different events. The easiest way I've found of doing that, and I will go ahead and cut this and paste in here because it is pretty easy to do. I'll bring it off of my cheat sheet on the left, which you cannot see, by simply doing a copy. And then I will simply paste them in here. And we'll line them up one at a time. There's one missing, but we'll show you how I edited that. So it is very basic of a formula. All I do is I create something called record type and I call it training. Yep, that's in the wrong place, obviously. Cutting and pasting has some of its own problems. So performance is down here. So again, what I do here is I create a record type called performance. Here I create a record type called training. And because I only pasted 2 of them in, I can just go ahead and copy this here, paste it again, put it up here, and this one I'm going to want to call this, making sure I'm in the right place, I'm going to call this birth. Again, a simple process, run this through. And you see that here I have all my birth records. And again, I don't care about which puppy it is because I'm going to be aggregating this up. Here are my training records, and here are my performance records. So now I feel very comfortable about bringing all this data together. For some reason, Union is not on the favorites, and I've just never moved it there. So here I want to go ahead and bring in the birth, the training, and the performance. Coming out of this, I have one final set of data, which is over 15,000 records, as you can see, and it has in it. Let's go ahead and, while we're doing this, go back to favorites and drop a browse on here because it helps us sort of rationalize and to verify our data as we go through this. Run this one more time, take a look at the browse. We can click on the browse on the record type, and you can see that we have performance, training, and births as our 3 values. So I am happy with that. So now we want to begin to bring in first our date, and then our breed, and then finally our kennel, and we do that all through joins. So let's go ahead and join our date dimension with our data flow. They all have now a common date attribute in there. So what we want to do is to go ahead and the warehouse ID, or the primary key ID for date, matches the pivot date that we're having. We don't want that on the left. We want to continue this through the join. I think we end up doing this about 3 different times just to keep things flowing. We can now run this. And checking on the right again, we can see that nothing has been left behind. And then here is our data that we now have the week of the year along with the other information that we were using. I decided that just for the sake of this process that we would clean this all up at the very end rather than clean it up after every step. So let's go ahead and join this in. We're going to go ahead and just leave this guy over here so I can join it in manually. Let's remove this guy here, join that, and we join our join to the right. Move it over so there's a little bit of space in there. And now, since this is the breed dimension, what we want to do is to bring in the warehouse ID for the breed dimension, and that will join to the breed warehouse ID that we have in our stream. And we'll just leave that look the way it is. So now looking at our stream coming out the other side, we have the breed name. Nothing's been left behind, so we can continue on. Our next join is going to be with the kennel. We'll drag our join down. So what happens when we plop this in the middle this time? Yeah, I thought so. So you can drop it and clean it up, or you can just completely clean it up to begin with. It happens to be your choice. I highlight that, hit the delete key, and it's gone because I want to do this on the left. Join to the right. And we're ready for one additional test run. Oops. Forgot to identify the warehouse ID. Matches the kennel warehouse ID. There we go. And again, if we look here, we see that we have 15,000 records, and we still have 15,000 coming out here. And now we have all the information that I needed. What I want to do finally is to go ahead and clean this up. Clean it up with a select. Get things in the order that I want to have to go forward with processing the data. Drop the select over here. And I do not need the warehouse ID. I like having the breed name at the top. So let's go ahead and move the breed name up. Then we have the kennel name. We do not need the state code. We don't need the rate of the WID. We do not need the date WID. We do not need the calendar date. We do need the week of the year. We'll move that up with our keep. But we can verify that we've turned everything off. We have the breed name, the kennel name, and the week of the year. Those are our dimensions. We do not need the warehouse ID, the pivot date warehouse ID, the kennel warehouse ID. We do, however, need the record type, and that is the fourth of our dimensions. So we have breed name, kennel name, record type, and the week of the year number. Run this one last time. And we can see that the data looks the way we wanted to see it. Breed name, kennel name, record type, and the week of the year number. So we're now ready to begin to process the data. But before I do that, I like to clean things up to make it a little bit easier as I work. I'm going to bring down my tool container and give it a name, which is called prep data. I'm actually going to go ahead and drop it way over here so it's out of the way. Make this smaller so I can get to everything. And I want to drop all of this except for the select into that container. Highlight them, drop them in. Notice it turns light blue. There they all are. So this is what I had to do to prep the data to get it into one stream of data that all has the same fields so I can begin the post-processing. The nice thing about this is I can now minimize it. It is out of the way, and we're going to begin to work on the continuation of that data flow. And I can go ahead and simply go back to a size where you can see it and I can see it. There we go. If I want to see what's in there, I can always expand it out, edit it as I need to, and then minimize it back again as I move forward. If I found this data set to be useful outside of the process that we're going through to turn it into a pivot table with an output of Excel, I would probably just go ahead and save this data set in a database or some other data store that I have so that it can be used in multiple places. I don't really have that vision for what we're trying to do with this data, so we're just going to continue to prep it and get it into that pivot table. So we're going to go ahead and drag this all the way to the right. You may say, what are you doing that for? Well, that's because there is a bunch of manipulations coming our way. So let's start by getting the summarizations that we need. We actually need 3 summarizations. So let's drop this one in here first, and we will do our first summarization, and that is where we want to do the line item rollups that we have. And to do that, it's quite simple. Let's choose breed. We add a group by kennel. We add a group by record type. We do a group by. And then finally, week of year number. We add a group by as well. And now just to round this out, we're going to, rather than call this record type, let's give it a better name. Event type. And then finally, we will need to get the actual metric in there. And what we want to do is get a count. We can pretty much choose any of these as a count. But since we're counting events, let's go ahead and just count on that field. And we're just going to call that count. So now we are going to create the actual basic data, which is our data summarized by breed, kennel, event, and the week. And so if we look at this data, and then because we are going straight line, we can drag our output up and see it. So now we have the data and we can see, there we go. So for Beagle, here are the different kennels and their birth events, the number of birth events that were by Beagle and kennel, and the week that they occurred in, and it stretches on down for a total of 70 to 99 records. We wanted to get a subtotal as well, and this is where Alteryx makes our life much more easy to create. So our subtotal is simply going to be by grouping it within the breed and the kennel. We have the final detail, which is the week of the year number that we also want to group by. And let's go ahead and continue to count our events or our record types. And so we add our count. I forgot this is a multiple subtotal. We just really want to do the subtotals by breed and not a positional subtotal. So we just want to have breed name and our week and our record type count to do our rollups summarization with. Run this, take a look at what's coming out of it, and you can see that this would be our Beagle and then our week number and our count. So we have a single line per breed. And then finally, we are going to want to have our grand total. Let's drag this down just a little bit to give us room for our grand total. We'll drop our summarize in down here, connect it up. And we will summarize that across the week of year, and then add in our count. So then here you can see we have our grand total line that will be across the bottom. So now we'll want to do some manipulations of the fields coming through here, but I decided to leave that for a separate process rather than do it individually. Because what we're going to want to look at doing is making sure they appear in the right order. So I'm going to put the data first together, clean up the nulls that are associated with the subtotal and total, and then sort it when I'm finally done. So what we want here obviously is the union. And when we run this, we will get a warning that not all the records have the same number of fields, which is fine because that's the subtotal and total lines. So if we look at what's come out of this, we have our detail lines skipping down to the bottom. Let's skip faster by dragging our scroll bar down. And you can see that here are our grand total records, and here are our subtotal records. So before we do the cleanup now comes the pivot part of all of this, because these are our dimensions, which we want down the left-hand side of our output. Let's drag this up again. There we go. So want these down the left side. The headings across the top will be the week of the year number, and then the cell value will be the count. And Alteryx has a widget that does it for us. It is also in the transform. I can now remember which one is pivot and unpivot because they decided to call them crosstab and transpose. But the icon here again shows us that we're taking rows, turning them into columns with the cross tab, and here we're taking columns and turning them into rows. So this is our unpivot and this is our pivot. So we just go ahead and drop our pivot in here. We need to identify the left-hand side of this, which is the breed name, the kennel name, and the event type. The heading and the columns is going to come from week number. And the count is going to be the value in there. Since summarize, and this is something that we could have done to a degree earlier, is that the crosstab also does aggregation, and so we can have done a sum in here. It's a bit trickier to do it this way. I found it much easier just to stick strictly with the summarize, union it together. But just in case, and we know they're all unique by the way, but in case they aren't unique, we can go ahead and just put the sum in here. We have to account for this aggregation possibility. So now when we run this, you see that we have now turned this up on its side. We now have our three dimensions. We have the week of the year across the top, and then we have our values in the middle. We want to get these into, basically we're done now, except for we want to get them into a nice sorted order. And to do that, we know that we want to get nulls to be last in our sorting. So what we're going to do is bring in a widget that I don't use that often, but this is just great for this, which is the multi-field formula. So we'll walk through how to do that as well, because what we want to do is to turn the breed name, kennel name, and event type into something more for our sort capabilities. That way we want these to come out at the end. So all that we want to do now is to use our numeric fields. Which are not our numeric fields. We're going to do that later. We want our text fields, and we want these 3 text fields. And if they're null, we want to go ahead and turn them into something to come up at the end. So we want to actually change the output. And so we want to create a quick formula. You can use the if then else. I use the IIF, which is the inline if then else. So we're going to check that is null. And what is null? The current field that we're dealing with. So if the current field is null, we want to give it a value of multiple z's. And I think I chose 7 when I was doing this originally, which seems a bit much. Let's go ahead with 8 just to keep it sort of standard. That way it will sort to the end. So if it is null, we give it all z's. Otherwise, we want it to keep its current value, which is from the current field. Close that out. It's happy with that. Let's run it. And you can see that their subtotal and our total now has z's across the board. Editing this out to make it so it doesn't get in the way too much. What we're doing is nulls to be last. We did this so that we can now sort this data to get it into the format that we need it to be. Always like to remember that I do not need a comment for my sorting unless there's a specific reason to, so I typically come in here and turn it off to begin with. Go back to the configuration of the sort, and we want to sort this by breed name, kennel name, and then event type. Running that through. Take a look at the data coming out of this. And you can see that if we go to the very end, here is our grand total, and here are the subtotals by breed. So we want to do a little cleanup here as well. I don't like these z's being in there. I want to blank them out except for specific ones. I'm going to do that in a more complex cleanup. So simply coming into another multi-field formula after the sort. Again, you can find different ways of cleaning this up. Maybe you don't want to clean it up at all. I contemplated just for a moment of using a find and replace to do this with, but I figured I would stay along with the multi-field formula. It essentially is the same as the previous one. If we come back here, we just sort of want to undo this. And so to make sure we do this properly, I'm going to go ahead and copy this out. Paste it in down here, because what I want to do is say that if the current field is equal to these z's, we want to give it a value of blanks. Otherwise, we want it to keep the current field as its value. That way I can do a little bit quicker editing of this. It is unhappy. Oh, we have one too many close parentheses. There we go. A quick check shows that I forgot to turn this field off. So it actually created a new field at the end. Love debugging on the fly. So now when we look at the output, we can see we have blanks instead of the Z's. The last thing I want to do is I'll also use a multi-field formula to get these nulls out of the numeric fields. I could do this a couple of different ways, but I figured I would stick with the multi-field formula. As I said before, in this case I want to choose all of the numeric fields. Check and make sure there's nothing strange in here. Expand that out. In this case I want to say if is null for the current field. Set it to 0, otherwise leave it the current field. Run that through. I do the same thing again. Getting used to this. Thinking ahead of myself. Oh, we don't want to change it. There we go. Run this through one more time. Nice to do the same bug twice in a row. It's not actually a bug, sorry. The same misstep twice in a row. There we go. Now we have all zeros. And then finally, in order to keep Soda out of doing this as a trouble, we're going to go ahead and I want to get subtotal in here, and I want to get total in here. And so that becomes a simple formula that I want to do for each record. And to keep myself from making the duplicate mistakes over again, we'll go ahead and just show that I will going to do this in 2 steps. The first one is quite simply, I make this big because you can see what I was doing before, is that if the breed name is empty, I wanted to say total. And then a complex clause, which is that if, and again, I trimmed these because it's actually blanks, and I use is empty because it's a text field. So I trim it out of breed name, and so if it becomes empty when I trim it, it becomes total. If the event name is empty and the breed name equals total is not equal to total, so here's the not equal, so I'm going to leave that total line alone, but that means that if the event name is empty and the breed name is total, it is now a subtotal record. And otherwise I keep the existing event name. Run through that, it is unhappy. Where'd my event name go? Oh, event type. Simple change for event type there. And we'll change this to event type here. If I can click on the right version of that, we have event type here. Probably just should have done this to begin with. So there's our event type. Should take care of that error. There we go. Having done that, we now can skip down to the bottom. We have zeros where all the null counts were, so it is easy to process into a graphical interface of some sort. Here I have subtotals for each of the individual breeds, and then I have a total line coming out at the bottom. So I'm happy at looking at this. If I was to do this for the next step, I would go ahead and just simply drag and drop in output onto here. So I can browse and look at it. I can output this data where I need to output it to. In this case, we can do it as an Excel spreadsheet. Let's go ahead and just do that. File. Here's my pivot table that I already used. To overwrite it, give it data for the name of the sheet. What we want to do is to overwrite file and remove it. Run this. Take a look at my output. And there you have it, the pivot table like you would normally see in Excel, generated from Alteryx, written out to Excel. So if you're used to post-processing this as an Excel spreadsheet, you can still do that, or you could actually save this somewhere else. So going through this, I hope you can follow along with the steps. This data is available on my Google Files SharePoint. If you check out some of my videos down below, I talk about how to get access to that and how to use that data. You can use that to follow along these steps. Please subscribe, give me some comments, give me some likes. Let me know you're out there watching. If you have any questions, trying to repeat this yourself, or see some ways that you would like to adapt this to your own data, please drop me a comment. I'll respond to you either within comments or create a new workflow just to show you what else you can do. So this is how I would work with a business analyst that really wants to see that pivot table in Excel. I can help them generate it so they're happy with the resulting output, but they do not have to use Excel to do all the data manipulations and bring all their data sources together. That is what Alteryx can do for you. Y'all have a great day.